The wind over the painted desert didn't just blow, it mourned, carrying the fine red grit of 1,000 broken plateaus into the creases of a man's skin until he became part of the geography itself. Silas Thorne sat his horse atop a ridge where the shadows of the mesas stretched out like long purple fingers reaching for the dying sun. He was a man of few words and even fewer comforts, his soul a map of jagged edges and dry creek beds. In his breast pocket, tucked behind the worn leather of his vest, lay a letter that had traveled 300 miles to find him, a scrap of paper that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood smoke, scents that had no business surviving in this land of sagebrush and alkali. The ink was faded, but the words were a brand. "The creek has run dry, Silas. The ranch is quiet, and I am tired of talking to the ghosts. If there is anything left of the boy who promised to come back, find him. The woman he left behind is fading." He hadn't seen Elena in 7 years, not since the day he'd ridden out with blood on his hands and a hole in his heart where his honor used to be. Yet the mere thought of her name felt like a spur to the ribs. The descent into the valley was a slow, punishing trek through the blue hour of twilight, the heat radiating off the rocks like the breath of a furnace. Silas watched the way his horse's ears flicked, listening to the silence that was never truly silent, the skitter of a lizard, the distant cry of a hawk, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather. He had spent years trying to outrun the memory of Elena's face, the way her eyes looked like the sky just before a storm, gray and turbulent and full of light. He had been a man of violence once, a hired gun for cattle barons who didn't care about the names of the people they displaced, until the weight of his sins became a burden he could no longer carry. He had sought redemption in the solitude of the high country, working as a drifter, a fence mender, a ghost among men. But the letter had stripped away his anonymity, calling him back to the one place he had sworn never to return, the valley of Bitter Creek, where his life had begun and, by all rights, should have ended. When the flickering lights of the town of Oakhaven finally appeared in the distance, they looked like fallen stars caught in the scrub. It was a town built on desperation and silver ore, a place where the law was as thin as the mountain air. Silas didn't stop at the saloon, though the smell of cheap whiskey and the sound of a tinny piano beckoned with the promise of easy oblivion. Instead, he kept riding past the outskirts, where the fences were mended with wire and prayer, until he reached the gate of the Sterling Ranch. The wood was silvered by age, the hinges groaning as he pushed through. There, at the end of a long, dust-choked drive, stood the house. It was a modest thing, built of cedar and stone, but to Silas it looked like a cathedral of lost time. A single lamp burned in the window, a steady amber glow against the encroaching blackness of the prairie. He dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull thud that felt like a heartbeat. His legs were stiff, his back aching, but the tension in his chest was what truly hindered his breath. He approached the porch, the spurs on his heels jingling with a sound that felt too loud for the stillness of the night. Before he could reach the door, it swung open. Elena stood there, framed by the light. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the sharp, elegant lines of her cheekbones. She didn't scream or weep, she simply stood with one hand on the doorframe, watching him with an intensity that made Silas feel as though he were being dismantled piece by piece. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the 1,000 things they hadn't said over a decade of distance. "You've grown old, Silas," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the voice of a woman who had spent too much time shouting into the wind. "The years haven't been kind to either of us, Elle," Silas replied, his own voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He took off his hat, clutching the brim until his knuckles turned white. "I got your letter. I didn't think you would come. I thought the desert had finally swallowed you whole." She stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. The house smelled of cinnamon and floor wax, a domesticity so sharp that it made Silas's eyes sting. He felt oversized and filthy in the small parlor, a predator in a sanctuary. He saw the way she looked at the holster cinched low on his hip, the way her gaze lingered on the scars that peeked out from her rolled sleeves. He was a man shaped by the frontier, a creature of iron and grit, and she was the only person who knew the soft, terrified center of him. They sat at the kitchen table, a scarred piece of oak where they had once shared dreams of a future that had been burned to ash. She poured him a cup of coffee, her hand steady but her fingers trembling slightly as she set the mug down. They spoke of the drought, of the failing cattle prices, of the way the town was changing, talking around the gaping wound of their shared history like it was a canyon they were afraid to fall into. Silas learned that her father had passed 2 years prior, leaving her to run the ranch alone, fighting off the land speculators who circled like vultures. She learned that he had spent his time in the north, moving from camp to camp, never staying long enough to leave a footprint. "Why did you really come back?" she asked suddenly, the pretense of small talk shattering. She leaned forward, the lamplight catching the tears she refused to let fall. "I didn't send that letter for help with the fences, Silas. I sent it because I'm losing this place, and I'm losing myself, and you're the only man I ever knew who understood what it meant to hold on to something that's already dead." Silas reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. His skin was dark and calloused, hers pale and translucent. "I came back because I realized that no matter how far I rode, I was always just circling you. I've spent 7 years trying to forget the way you looked the day I left, and all I managed to do was memorize every shadow of your face in the dark." The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elena closed her eyes, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a slow path down her temple. "You left me in the smoke, Silas. You left me to explain to the sheriff why there were 3 dead men in our barn and why my husband-to-be was gone with the morning mist. I loved you and you broke me." "I did it to keep you alive," he whispered, the old agony flaring up in his chest. "If I had stayed, they would have come for you too. I had to lead them away." "You could have taken me with you," she countered, her voice rising with a decade's worth of suppressed rage. "We could have been ghosts together. Instead, you made me a widow to a man who wasn't even dead yet." The night deepened, the silence of the prairie pressing against the windows like a physical weight. Silas didn't defend himself further. There was no defense for the choices a desperate man makes. He slept that night in the barn, the familiar scent of hay and horsehide a better fit for his soul than the soft linens of the guest room. He lay awake, listening to the coyotes howling in the hills, a sound that mirrored the loneliness in his own gut. He realized then that redemption wasn't a destination you reached, it was a fire you had to walk through every single day. Over the next few weeks, a quiet rhythm established itself. Silas worked the land with a grim, relentless focus, repairing the corrals, digging a deeper well, and culling the sickly calves from the herd. He and Elena moved around each other like 2 planets in a precarious orbit, drawn together by gravity but terrified of the collision. There were moments of agonizing closeness, the way their hands brushed when he handed her a bucket of water, the way she watched him from the porch as he broke a stubborn colt, the way the silence between them began to feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. He saw the strength in her, the way she managed the books and the labor with a fierce, quiet dignity, and he felt a renewed sense of awe for the woman she had become in his absence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a riot of orange and gold, they sat on the porch steps, the air cooling rapidly. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic click of the metal the only sound. Elena was sewing, her needle darting in and out of a piece of muslin. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked softly, not looking up from her work. Silas paused, his thumb tracing the cold steel of the barrel. "Every hour of every day, Elle. I see a house with children in the yard. I see a version of myself that never picked up a gun. I see us old and gray, sitting right here, but with hearts that don't hurt so much." "It's not too late for the gray hair," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "But the hearts? I don't know if those can be mended. Some things, once broken, just stay broken. You just learn to live with the jagged edges." "Maybe," Silas said, looking out at the vast, uncaring expanse of the West. "Or maybe you just need the right kind of solder to hold the pieces together." The peace was shattered 3 days later when a group of riders appeared on the horizon, the dust from their horses' hooves a dark omen against the blue sky. Silas knew who they were before they even reached the gate: Julian Vane and his pack of regulators. Vane was a man who dressed in fine broadcloth and spoke with a silver tongue, but his eyes were as cold as a mountain lake in January. He had been trying to buy the Sterling Ranch for years, wanting the water rights for his own burgeoning empire. Silas felt the old, familiar coldness settle in his marrow, the killer's instinct he had tried so hard to bury. He stood on the porch, his hand resting near his holster, as the men rode up. Elena came out behind him, her face pale but her chin set high. "You're not welcome here, Mr. Vane. I've told you my answer." Vane tipped his hat, a gesture that was more insult than courtesy. "Now, Miss Elena, let's not be hasty. The drought isn't going anywhere, and neither are your debts. I'm offering you a way out, a comfortable life in town, away from this dust and toil." His gaze shifted to Silas, his eyes narrowing. "And who is this? A new hand or just a stray you picked up?" "I'm the man who's going to ask you to leave," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Once." Vane laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You've got a big mouth for a drifter. Do you know who I am?" "I know you're a man who hides behind his hired help, and I know that if you don't turn those horses around, I'm going to have to start counting." The tension was a physical cord stretched to the breaking point. Vane's men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their weapons. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, with a sneer, Vane pulled his horse around. "This isn't over, Sterling. You can't hide behind a ghost forever." As they rode away, Elena let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She turned to Silas, her eyes wide with fear. "He'll be back. He doesn't take no for an answer. He's destroyed better families than mine for less than this." "I know," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the retreating dust. "That's why I'm not leaving again." The conflict escalated the following week. Fences were cut, a barn was set on fire in the dead of night, and Elena's cattle were driven off into the breaks. The pressure was relentless, a slow tightening of the noose. Silas slept even less, patrolling the perimeter with his rifle, his mind a whirlwind of tactical possibilities. He saw the toll it was taking on Elena, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she jumped at every sound. One night, after a particularly grueling day of tracking strayed cattle, he found her sitting in the kitchen, the lamp unlit, weeping silently in the dark. He didn't speak. He simply went to her and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a second, her body stiff with pride, and then she collapsed against him, her sobs racking her thin frame. Silas held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, feeling the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it frightened him. He had spent his life destroying things. He didn't know if he was capable of saving anything, let alone the woman he loved. "I'm so tired, Silas," she whispered into his chest. "I've got you," he said, the words a vow. "I've got you, Elle. Let me carry it for a while." They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people clinging to each other in the middle of a vast, indifferent wilderness. In that moment, the years of betrayal and silence seemed to fall away, replaced by a raw, aching honesty. Silas realized that his redemption wasn't about erasing his past, it was using the hardness the world had given him to protect the one light he had left. The climax came on a Tuesday, a day when the heat was so intense it seemed to warp the very air. Silas had seen the riders coming from miles away, a dark smudge on the horizon. This time there were more of them, and they weren't coming to talk. He ushered Elena into the cellar, despite her protests. "Stay there," he commanded, his eyes hard and focused. "No matter what you hear, do not come out until I call for you." "Silas, please," she begged, clutching his arm. "Don't do this. Don't let them turn you back into that man." He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, desperate contact that tasted of salt and longing. "That man is the only one who can keep you safe right now." He took his position behind a stack of cordwood near the barn, his Winchester loaded and ready. As the riders crested the final rise, they fanned out, their intentions clear. Vane was in the center, looking like a king on his black stallion. They opened fire before they were even in range, the bullets thudding into the wood of the house and the barn with a sound like hailstones. Silas waited, his breath slow and even, his heart a steady drumbeat. He wasn't a man afraid of death, he had looked into its eyes too many times to be intimidated. The gunfight was a chaotic, blurring symphony of noise and smoke. Silas moved with a lethal efficiency, his shots finding their mark with terrifying precision. He felt the sting of a bullet grazing his shoulder, the heat of the black powder on his face, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. One by one, Vane's men fell or retreated, unable to withstand the calculated fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Finally, it was Silas and Vane, the latter's horse having been shot out from under him. Vane stood in the middle of the yard, his fine clothes covered in dust, his face a mask of panicked rage. "You're a dead man, Thorne," Saint Vane screamed, his hand shaking as he leveled his pistol. "You can't win. I have the law. I have the money." "You have nothing," Silas said, stepping out from behind the woodpile. He didn't raise his rifle, he simply walked towards Vane, his eyes fixed on the other man's eyes. "You fired," the bullet whistling past Silas's ear. Silas didn't flinch. He kept walking, a grim reaper in denim and leather. Vane fired again, the shot going wide as his nerves finally shattered. Silas reached him, his hand lashing out to wrench the pistol from Vane's grasp. He then grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the side of the barn. "Get off my land," Silas hissed, the words dripping with a cold, distilled malice. "If I ever see your face again, if I even hear your name mentioned in this valley, I will hunt you down to the ends of the earth. Do you understand me?" Vane nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Silas shoved him away, watching as the man scrambled towards his remaining riders and fled into the shimmering heat. Silas stood in the middle of the yard, his chest heaving, his blood dripping on the parched earth. The silence that followed was deafening, the smoke from the rifles lingering in the air like a shroud. He heard the cellar door creak open. Elena emerged, her eyes searching the yard until they found him. She ran to him, her feet flying over the dirt, and threw her arms around him. Silas winced as she hit his injured shoulder, but he didn't pull away. He held her close, the smell of her hair the only thing that felt real in a world made of fire and lead. "It's over," she whispered, her face buried in his neck. "It's over," he agreed, the tension finally beginning to drain from his body. "They won't be back." The healing was slow, much like the building of their love. The wounds on Silas's body healed faster than the wounds on his soul, but with Elena by his side, the shadows didn't seem quite so long. They worked the ranch together, side by side, finding a new language in the shared labor and the quiet evenings. There was no grand wedding, no public declarations. Their commitment was written in the way they looked at each other over the dinner table, in the way they held hands under the vast, star-strud sky, in the way they chose every single day to stay. The drought eventually broke, the rain coming down in a torrential, life-giving flood that turned the brown hills green almost overnight. Silas and Elena stood on the porch, watching the water soak into the thirsty earth, the sound of it a percussion of hope. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, the two of them a testament to the endurance of the human heart. "We made it, Silas," she said softly, the rain misting her face. "We did," he agreed, looking out at the horizon where the clouds were finally breaking, revealing a sliver of brilliant, untroubled blue. "I reckon we finally found our way home." The American frontier was a place that broke men and women, a land of harsh beauty and unforgiving truths. But for Silas Thorne and Elena Sterling, it was also a place of second chances, where the dust of the past could be washed away by the rain of the present, and where a quiet, hard-won love could grow even in the most barren of soils. They were ghosts no longer. They were people of the land, rooted deep and reaching for the sun, their story a whisper in the wind that would echo through the canyons for generations to come.